woke up again with that overwhelming feeling. My chest felt trapped under a weight I couldn't quite describe. The room, which was usually my refuge, now seemed suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to get up, but the mere thought of moving felt like an enormous effort. I knew the world was still out there. Work, people, the plans I had made. But in that moment, everything seemed so distant. I asked myself, what for? Why get up? There were days when I felt completely empty, for no apparent reason. Other times, a deep sadness would take over, making me feel like I was slowly sinking with no way out. It wasn't just a lack of motivation. It was something much bigger. Something that drained every last bit of my strength. Sometimes, I would look in the mirror and see a stranger. Where was the girl who used to be full of life and dreams? I couldn't find her anymore. All I felt was the exhaustion of fighting against something I couldn't even explain.
I'm Rachel Harper. Today, I'm sharing a story that highlights the deep struggles many face behind closed doors. This story is based on real events, but some names and details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. If this story resonates with you, please consider sharing, liking, and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Now let's get into today's story.
My name is Sophia. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a graphic designer and content creator on YouTube. From an early age, I was always known for my creativity, especially in design. My YouTube channel started as something light, a way to share my passion for fashion and beauty. But over time, I realized I wanted to show more of who I really am, including the personal struggles I face. Depression came into my life unexpectedly. I was 19 in college when it all began. I experienced intense bullying from my roommates, something that deeply affected my mental health. I vividly remember the emotional pain of that time. I tried to push through, but eventually, I dropped out of college. My doctors labeled what I was going through as situational depression, since there was a clear cause: the psychological abuse I endured. After a while, I managed to recover from that first episode. By the time I was 26, everything seemed to finally be on track. I had a solid group of friends. I was in a healthy relationship, and my career in design and YouTube was thriving. But even with everything seemingly perfect, the depression came back. This time, with no clear reason. Every day, I woke up feeling empty, incredibly tired, and overcome with a sadness that seemed to take over my entire being. At first, I didn't realize depression was creeping back in. The early signs were subtle, almost unnoticeable. I had always been a lively person, full of energy and ideas for new projects, both in my work as a graphic designer and for my YouTube channel. But suddenly, things began to shift. What used to bring me joy, like creating content and sharing my life, started to lose its meaning. It felt like the colors of my days were fading, as if a fog was covering my vision. I started feeling constantly exhausted, but in my mind, it was just a phase of work-related burnout. I thought that with a little rest, I'd be back to my usual self. However, over time, I realized it wasn't just fatigue. I felt unmotivated, irritated by things that used to bring me happiness. The emptiness grew, and I kept asking myself over and over, why am I feeling this way when my life seems to be going so well? Right after those early signs, the heavier thoughts set in. The constant feeling of sinking was always present. I began doubting myself, my abilities, and even started disconnecting from the people I loved. My friends, my boyfriend Daniel. I withdrew more and more, but I couldn't even explain why. There was a sadness I couldn't name, a fog that covered everything. At work, things started to fall apart. I procrastinated on simple tasks, and the quality of my work plummeted. Projects that used to excite me now felt like a burden. And on YouTube, recording videos became torture. The pressure to always appear smiling and happy in front of the camera was unbearable. My social life took a major hit too. I isolated myself more and more, avoiding friends and even Daniel. Even surrounded by people who cared, the feeling of loneliness was crushing. My friends noticed something was wrong and would ask what was going on, but I simply didn't have an answer. Saying "I'm fine" became almost a reflex, when in reality, nothing was fine. The reactions from those around me were mixed. At first, no one noticed what was happening because I tried to hide how I was feeling. But when the changes became too obvious to ignore, my parents grew extremely concerned and urged me to seek help. They thought I was going through something similar to the bullying I had experienced in college. But this time, it was different. Some friends tried to cheer me up, but over time, a few drifted away, thinking I was being distant. Daniel was one of the first to realize that something was very wrong. He tried to be understanding, but the lack of communication between us only added to the tension. He was frustrated that he couldn't help, and I felt even more guilty because of it. The solid relationship we once had began to suffer, and I felt more alone than ever. As time went on, what initially felt like just exhaustion turned into something much darker. There were days when I simply couldn't get out of bed. Why even bother? What am I doing with my life? These thoughts would play on repeat in my head. The mere idea of getting up, getting dressed, and facing the world seemed like an impossible task. I remember one morning in particular. I woke up with an overwhelming sense of anguish, a heaviness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Everything around me felt distant and lifeless. I tried to find some reason, any reason to get out of bed, but I couldn't. I stayed there for hours, paralyzed, as if my body no longer obeyed my will. The feeling of worthlessness was so intense that I didn't even have the strength to cry. These episodes became more frequent. Some days I could manage to get up, but my energy would drain quickly. There were moments when I'd start crying for no apparent reason, and other times, I just felt numb, as if I were watching my life from the outside, unable to feel any real emotion. I felt like a ghost, present in the world but invisible and disconnected from everything and everyone. Depression hit my career hard. My YouTube channel, which had once been a source of joy and creativity, became an unbearable pressure. I started skipping uploads, failing to post new videos. Some people sent me supportive messages, but others demanded more content, and that only added to my feelings of guilt and failure. I could no longer meet my followers' expectations, and that destroyed me inside. In my work as a graphic designer, things were also falling apart. I would stare at my computer screen for hours, unable to make any progress on a project. The creativity that once flowed so easily seemed to have evaporated. This created a vicious cycle of self-sabotage. The more I failed, the more guilty and frustrated I felt, which only fueled the depression further. At first, I tried to handle these crises on my own. I thought it was just a phase, something I could overcome if I pushed hard enough. I tried to use the strategies I'd relied on years ago when I overcame the depression caused by bullying in college. But nothing seemed to work this time. I felt lost, and often, I was afraid to ask for help. The fear of being seen as weak kept me pretending that everything was fine, when, in reality, I was sinking deeper and deeper. The isolation was one of the worst aspects of this period. I pushed away the people who mattered most, especially Daniel. He tried to help, but I couldn't open up to him. With each crisis, the guilt grew, and I felt like a burden, as if the world would be better off without me. Although I never acted on these thoughts, they were always there, lurking in the back of my mind, and every day felt like an internal battle to maintain control. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep going like that. I couldn't control the negative thoughts that consumed me, and the feeling of sinking was constant. One of the hardest days was during a visit to my parents' house. I could barely get out of bed during the week, so I decided to spend a few days with them, thinking a change of scenery might help. But sitting in the living room of the house I grew up in, surrounded by childhood memories, everything felt even more suffocating. My parents were worried, asking questions I couldn't answer. They tried to understand what was happening, wondering if I was dealing with bullying again like I had in college. But this time, there wasn't an obvious external cause. What I was feeling didn't make sense, not even to me. When I realized I couldn't explain it to myself, let alone to others, I broke down. For the first time, I admitted that I wasn't okay, and that I couldn't handle this on my own. Saying that out loud was a relief, but it also terrified me. Even after admitting that I needed help, accepting treatment was a challenge. I had this huge mental block. In my head, seeking help meant I'd failed. I thought that if I couldn't pull myself out of this, it meant something was wrong with me, that I was weak. I worried about what people around me would think, especially when it came to medication. I kept asking myself, am I really that bad off that I need meds? It was an internal battle, because I was also afraid of exposing myself. What did treatment even involve? How did therapy work? I didn't know where to start, and more than that, I was terrified at the thought of opening up to a stranger, of admitting my vulnerabilities. The feeling of losing control was overwhelming, and for a while, I kept resisting the idea of seeking professional help. But with encouragement from my parents, I finally took the first step. I went to the doctor, accompanied by them, and underwent several tests to rule out any physical causes for what I was feeling. When the diagnosis of clinical depression was confirmed, I felt a mix of relief and fear. On the one hand, there was a chemical explanation for what I was going through. It wasn't all in my head. But on the other hand, facing the idea that this was a chronic condition was crushing. I started treatment with antidepressants and, over time, was referred to a specialized therapist. In the first sessions, I felt completely lost. I didn't know how to put into words what I was feeling. Often, all I could say was, I don't know where to begin. It was uncomfortable. I felt vulnerable, but I knew I had to keep going. Slowly, I began to trust the therapist and, little by little, I started opening up. Along with medical treatment, I began reconnecting with some people. One of the first was my best friend, Julia. She saw how serious the situation was, and instead of pulling away, she offered unconditional support. Sometimes, she would just sit and listen without saying anything, and that was enough to make me feel like I wasn't so alone. Daniel also stood by me, even when our relationship was going through a rough patch. His patience, along with my parents' support, was crucial in helping me start to rebuild myself. That moment of asking for help was a mix of fear and relief. Admitting that I couldn't handle this alone was a big step, but it also put me on an uncertain path where I still couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it was the beginning of something new, a journey of self-discovery and caring for my mental health. Over time, I realized that I needed to find ways to manage depression in my daily life. Recovery didn't happen overnight, and I often felt frustrated by how slow the process was. But little by little, I discovered tools that helped me get through each day, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. One of the first things I learned in therapy was the importance of having a routine. At first, committing to a schedule seemed impossible, but my therapist encouraged me to take small steps. Getting out of bed at a set time, taking a shower, and eating meals. Simple tasks that once felt overwhelming started to become small victories when I managed to complete them. These actions gave me a sense of control, something that had felt so distant during my lowest moments. Another important discovery was self-care. Meditation was something I had never considered, but I began practicing guided meditations. In the beginning, it was tough. My mind was always racing, and it felt impossible to focus. But with time and practice, I started to notice brief moments of calm. Those moments of peace became a breath of fresh air in the middle of the storm. Professional support was also crucial. In addition to therapy, I started attending a support group for people with depression. At first, it was terrifying to share my experience with strangers. but soon I realized that those people were going through something similar. Hearing their stories and knowing I wasn't alone brought me a sense of relief. It was freeing to be in a space where I didn't have to justify or hide what I was feeling. And sometimes, I was able to offer support to others, which gave me a sense of purpose and connection. Over time, therapy began to make more sense to me. I learned to identify the triggers that worsened my depression, and, more importantly, to recognize the negative thought patterns that fueled the cycle. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, was a technique that helped me a lot. I began challenging the automatic thoughts that dragged me down, and slowly, I was able to replace them with more balanced perceptions. Amid all of this, I started to notice small moments of relief. A simple ray of sunlight coming through the window, the sound of a song I liked, or even the smell of morning coffee. Small things that made me feel for a brief moment that life could be good. These moments were fleeting, but I learned to cherish them, holding on to them as reminders that not everything was lost. That's when I realized that no matter how small, each day had a moment that reminded me that life could still have color. One of the biggest lessons I learned was that depression doesn't disappear overnight, but it can be managed. I stopped blaming myself for not always being happy or productive, and finally understood that my worth wasn't tied to those standards. It was liberating to realize that I could give myself permission to have bad days without feeling like a failure. Rediscovering my hobbies was also essential to my recovery process. I've always loved drawing and painting, but during the most intense phase of my depression, I lost that pleasure. Slowly, I started drawing again, at first just as a distraction, but soon I realized that art was more than that. It was a way to process my emotions, a way to express what I often couldn't put into words. Additionally, taking care of my body became part of the process. I've never been a fan of exercise, but I started taking 20-minute walks outdoors every day. This simple habit gave me a new connection with nature and with my own body, something I hadn't valued before. Even on days when I felt exhausted, that walk became an act of self-care that I prioritized. My relationships also went through a reevaluation. During the worst moments of depression, I distanced myself from many important people. Now, I'm slowly reconnecting with those who showed empathy and understanding. I also learned to set boundaries with people who didn't contribute positively to my mental health. It was difficult, but distancing myself from friendships that drained me emotionally was a necessary step in my recovery. After months of treatment, I began to notice small but significant victories. The fight against depression was far from over, but I finally felt like I was making progress, even if it was slow. Gestures that once seemed trivial began to turn into important milestones on my path to recovery. One of the first moments I felt victorious was when I managed to leave the house for a walk on my own after a particularly hard week. For days, I had felt an immense weight, preventing me from doing even the most basic activities. But that day, something changed. It was sunny, and despite the lack of motivation, I put on my headphones and went for a walk in the park. I walked slowly, breathing deeply, trying to absorb the surroundings. It wasn't a long walk, but by the end, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. For many, it may seem like something small, but for me, it was a clear sign that I was slowly taking control of my life again. Another important milestone was when I started finding joy again in the things that used to make me happy. For weeks, I had been procrastinating, uninterested in practically everything. Until one day, I decided to draw again. I sat at my desk, with pencils and paper in front of me, and spent hours absorbed in the creative process. It wasn't about producing a masterpiece, but about allowing myself to enjoy creating without any pressure. That moment reminded me of who I was before depression took over my life, and it gave me hope that I could regain more parts of myself over time. I also began to realize that I was becoming more resilient to everyday challenges. Before, any small obstacle would make me crumble, but gradually, I I started handling setbacks in a more balanced way. A clear example of this was when I received negative feedback on one of my YouTube videos. In the past, this would have ruined my day, maybe even my week. But this time, I managed to filter the impact, focusing only on constructive criticism without letting it define my worth. That was a huge step forward in how I saw myself. These small moments of victory taught me an important lesson. They were reminders that even when everything seemed to be falling apart, there was strength inside me. Over time, I understood that progress isn't linear. There were still bad days, but the good days were becoming more frequent. And on the bad days, I learned to remind myself that they were part of the process, that there was no pressure to get better all at once, but that every step, no matter how small, was a victory. These moments also taught me the importance of celebrating the small wins. I started being kinder to myself, recognizing that even simple actions like getting out of bed, eating, or going to therapy were victories worth celebrating. The pressure for grand achievements was replaced with an appreciation for small steps. To help maintain this perspective, I started journaling. Instead of focusing only on the difficult days, I wrote down each small victory. I read through these notes on tough days, and they gave me the strength to keep going. The journal became a powerful tool to combat the negative thoughts that still surfaced, though now less frequently. Over time, I began to understand that depression wasn't something I could just overcome once and for all. It's still part of my life, and it might show up again at certain moments, but now I have more tools to face it. This new perspective came from the small victories I've achieved along the way, and from accepting that the recovery journey is anything but linear. Even though I know the struggle isn't completely over, I feel much more equipped to handle the challenges that may come. Today, I see my life with more compassion and realism. I've learned to accept that depression is a part of me, but it doesn't define who I am. I am not my illness. This is one of the most powerful lessons I carry with me. It's helped me separate the hard moments from my identity. Of course, there are still days when I feel overwhelmed, but now I know those days aren't permanent. I know that with time, things get better, and therapy and self-care practices remain a crucial part of my routine, helping me stay balanced. Another important thing I've realized is that there's nothing wrong with asking for help again if I need it. In the past, fear of appearing weak kept me from reaching out for support, but now I know that true strength lies in recognizing that vulnerability. I feel stronger knowing I can rely on others when I need to. I often remind myself, and that gives me the security to face challenges without feeling alone. I see the fight against depression as ongoing, but it no longer terrifies me like it used to. Today, I'm armed with tools that help me stay in control, even when I feel myself starting to slip. Therapy, medication, and daily self-care routines are all part of my strategy to cope. Plus, I've kept up with drawing, which helps me process my emotions, and I still participate in my support group, where I exchange experiences and receive support from people going through similar situations. Another important change has been reducing the pressure I put on myself. Before, I felt guilty for not keeping up the pace I thought I should. Now, I've learned that I don't need to be productive all the time to be valuable. I've realized that rest days are just as important as work days, and this has helped ease some of the pressure I was putting on myself. For anyone going through something similar, I want to leave a message of hope. I know how hard it is. There are days when it feels like things will never get better, but those days aren't permanent. What helped me was understanding that I didn't have to fight it alone. The path may be long and not always easy, but there are people and resources that can help you navigate through the darkness. I believe sharing my experience can help others who feel isolated. Even in moments when everything seems to be falling apart, there's always a way to find light, whether it's through a friend, a professional, or even small moments that bring relief. No matter how small those victories seem, they matter. Today, I'm still dedicated to taking care of my relationships and my passions. I know I need to maintain a constant balance, caring for both my mental and physical health. My relationship with Daniel, which went through so many difficulties, has also grown stronger. We've both learned to communicate our needs and expectations better, and we've built a stronger foundation of mutual support. When I think about the future, I feel more open and hopeful. I don't expect a life completely free of difficulties, but I'm confident that I now have the strength and the resources to face whatever challenges may come. Looking back at everything I've gone through with depression, I realize that despite all the challenges, this experience has taught me valuable lessons about myself and about life. I never chose to go through this, but today I can see how the fight against depression has shaped me. I've discovered an inner strength I didn't know I had. Before, I believed life followed a straight line, that success was measured by productivity, constant happiness, and achievements. But depression forced me to rethink all of that. I've learned that we aren't defined by our lowest moments, but by how we respond to them. This is one of the greatest lessons I've taken from this journey, a new perspective on what it means to be truly strong. I've also learned that depression shouldn't be faced alone. In the past, I shut myself off from the world, thinking I had to solve my problems on my own. Today, I know that asking for help is a sign of courage, not weakness. The most important thing I've learned is that there's no shame in being vulnerable. True strength is in recognizing when we need support. My journey continues, and I know that seeking balance requires constant attention. I've gotten better at managing depression, but I understand that this battle doesn't disappear completely. That's why I remain committed to taking care of my mental health, staying connected to professionals, friends, and the wellness practices that help me. Healing isn't a final destination, but a path we walk every day, is something I often reflect on. And that's the message I want to leave for anyone going through something similar. Help is available to those who seek it. Don't let fear or pride stop you from getting the support you deserve. If you're struggling right now, know that your struggle is valid and you're not alone. Yes, there will be tough days, but there will also be better ones. The key is to never give up on yourself, even when it feels like everything is lost. There's always a ray of hope, no matter how small, and that's what you need to hold on to. Don't underestimate the power of small acts of self-care, and remember that every step, no matter how small, is a victory. These little progresses are the first signs that things can change. With that, I close my story, hoping that it brings some comfort and hope to those facing difficult times. My journey wasn't easy, but looking back, I see how it's made me more resilient and more capable of overcoming the challenges that may still lie ahead. With all my gratitude, Sophia.
As we conclude Sophia's story, her words remind us of how depression can be an invisible battle, but not one that has to be fought alone. Every small victory is a step towards recovery, and sharing our struggles can be the beginning of a healing journey. If this story resonated with you or someone you know, remember that seeking support is an act of courage. In the comments, feel free to share your experience or offer words of encouragement. Your words might be exactly what someone needs to hear. And if you're not yet part of our community, subscribe and turn on notifications to continue following stories like this. Together, we can create a space where every voice is heard and every story matters.